All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight with us today for this very special event. Today is the official launch day for our second digital project at the John L. Now III Center for Civil War History at the University of Virginia. Our first digital project, which we launched back in April, was Black Virginians in Blue. And today's project is UVA Unionists, which is a study of how of the 68 men who served in the Union Army, Navy, or in the state militias on behalf of the Union during the American Civil War. Uh, I would like to thank everybody who is here with us from Zoom and everybody who has joined us on Facebook Live. If you all have any questions for either myself, I am Dr. William Kurtz, the Managing Director and Digital Historian at the Now Center, or Brian Newman, who I will introduce shortly. Please send them to us through the Q&A, not through the chat, but through the Q&A in Zoom. And then if you send them as comments through Facebook, we have someone monitoring Facebook and they will be relayed to us as well. We will get to as many questions as possible. Closed captioning is available on Zoom. If you go down to your controls and click on the live transcript, you will get a live transcript of today's talk. So let me first begin by introducing Brian Newman. Brian, will you join us? Great. Thank you, Brian. Brian Newman received his PhD from UVA in 2020 and is currently the editorial assistant for the Now Civil War Center, working on both digital projects. He also served as a member of UVA's President's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation, and he was, as an undergraduate, a research assistant for Furman University's 50th Anniversary Desegregation Commemoration Committee. His book, The Bloody Flag of Anarchy, Unionism in South Carolina During the Nullification Crisis, will be released by LSU Press next year in 2022. And so before I let Brian begin, Brian's going to lead us off today with a talk about our Unionists, giving you an overview, highlighting some of the stories, some of the most interesting stories that we've discovered in our research. But before he does that, and before I give you, and then we move on to a short website demonstration, and then to our question and answer session at the very end, just let me say a few words about Brian and all the great work that he's done on this project. When I first started as digital historian, I was really focused on Black Virginians in Blue and finding as many Black men from Albemarle County served in the Union military as possible. I put this project, UVA Unionist, on the back burner, and I only had about 20 men that I had found in my spare time. So one day, Brian walks into my office and says, I've just looked through all of the antebellum UVA catalogs, and I have a list of 50 men. And my jaw hit the floor. I was like, who is this guy? And he did it so quickly and so efficiently and so well. And in fact, he's even in the last few weeks, he's found even more UVA Unionists by double checking some of his research, which he'll talk about in a little bit more detail. There were a lot of people, a lot of undergraduates who helped out. We're very grateful to the Jefferson Trust for providing the funding for the UVA Unionist website and for the work on UVA Unionists. And we're very grateful for the Institute for Advanced Technology and the Humanities and all the many undergraduates who've worked on this project. But nobody has done more work to find and more archives and has found more of the UVA Unionists than Brian Newman. So with that, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, all. Good evening, and thank you all so much for being here. First, thank you to Will Kurtz, Dr. Varian, Dr. Janey for supporting me and for allowing me to be here. It's an incredible honor, and I can't begin to tell you how much it means to me. So, secession and Civil War left Joseph Cabell Breckinridge's family deeply divided. His father, Robert Breckinridge, was a renowned Kentucky minister who supported gradual emancipation and joined the Republican Party during the war. His cousin was John C. Breckinridge, who ran for president in 1860 on a militantly pro-slavery platform. Two of Joseph's brothers, became Confederate colonels, and one helped guard Jefferson Davis as he fled from Richmond in the final weeks of the war. Joseph, however, shared his father's Unionist convictions, and he left school in 1861 to join the Union Army. Joseph fought at Shiloh and Corinth in 1862 and took part in the Atlanta campaign 2 years later. He was captured in the woods outside Atlanta and spent 2 harrowing months in a Confederate prison camp. He was released in October of 1864 and went home to Kentucky in broken health. In his own words, quote, ragged, sick, and dirty. But his time as a prisoner of war only hardened his resolve, and he proudly went to the polls that November to help re-elect Abraham Lincoln. Breckinridge stayed in the Army after the war, eventually becoming a Major General and the Inspector General of the Army. He was also a lifelong Republican who cherished and kept alive the memory of the Union cause. He joined veterans groups like the Loyal Legion and the Grand Army of the Republic, and attended reunions and monument dedications across the country. At one of those reunions in 1900, he declared the Civil War, quote, a righteous war to settle the questions of national unity and human slavery. He vividly recalled the, quote, heat and dust, rain and sickness and wounds, all proving that the world was young and the cause was right. He paid tribute to the soldiers and sailors who had saved the Union, observing that, quote, our hearts cling to them, so the world will not willingly let their names die. Now, while Breckinridge was making this passionate plea for the world to remember, his own alma mater, UVA, had embarked on a bold campaign to forget, to rewrite the past and erase the memory of men like him who had stayed loyal to the Union. Almost immediately after the war, UVA's faculty and alumni helped piece together the lost cause, the myth that all Southerners had faithfully and valiantly served the Confederacy, the myth that they had fought not for slavery, but for states' rights. UVA kept careful records on thousands of Confederate alumni. It hosted Confederate reunions, built Confederate monuments, and published long eulogies of its Confederate dead. But this lost cause narrative had no place for the division and dissent that Unionist alumni like Joseph Breckinridge represented. And so UVA's ceremonies and publications almost entirely excluded them. In the 1870s, for example, UVA published a catalog of all its alumni, listing their occupations, their achievements, their military service. And it celebrated Joseph's brother Robert as a judge, a Confederate officer, and a Confederate congressman. But for Joseph, the catalog said only, quote, Joseph Breckinridge, Springfield, Missouri. In 1913, a Stanton writer chastised UVA and other local schools for, quote, almost entirely overlooking their sons who served in the federal forces. And UVA's alumni bulletin finally confessed that, quote, no complete list has been made of the university alumni who saw service in the Union Army. Now, more than a century later, the now Civil War Center has answered that call. After 4 years of research, project staffers have found dozens of students, alumni, and faculty members who remained loyal to the Union, including 68 soldiers and sailors and 3 congressmen. Our UVA Unionist website recovers these men's stories. And their stories capture a wide range of Civil War experiences. These men were doctors, lawyers, farmers, teachers, and students. Some were the sons and brothers of senators, while others came from humble backgrounds. On the eve of the war, they ranged in age from 14 to 57 and lived in 14 different states. About half served on the front lines during the war, like Joseph Breckinridge. The others spent the war as prison guards, paymasters, recruiters, medical personnel, or home guards. However they served, most served the Union cause faithfully and commendably. 3/4 of these men became officers, and 7 eventually became generals. 2 died during the war, both from medical issues unrelated to wartime service, but many others suffered from illness or injury, and at least 6 became prisoners of war. Their lives speak to many important themes, but I'll focus on 4. The wartime divisions within the South, the power and importance of the Union, the political moderation of most loyal Americans, and seemingly paradoxically, the war's transformative potential. First, wartime divisions. In the early 1900s, the very few writers that acknowledged UVA's Unionists explained away their Union service by saying they were all Northern students. That Stanton editor from 1913, for example, assumed they, quote, must have been Northern boys who stuck to their people and their native land. In reality, 2/3 of UVA's Unionists came from the South, from Maryland, Kentucky, Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and even South Carolina. And roughly half came from slaveholding families. Now, it's important to note that most UVA alumni and most Southerners supported the Confederacy. Our research found that 50% of all antebellum alumni fought in the Confederate Army, including 90% of the students who attended UVA in 1861. By contrast, only 1% of UVA's alumni and faculty fought for the Union. Now, these figures demonstrate the power and the prevalence of Confederate nationalism. But UVA's Unionists remind us that that Confederate nationalism, that support for the Confederacy, was not inevitable or unanimous. Other choices were always possible, and thousands of Southerners made them. 4 Southern states stayed loyal to the Union, and a large part of Virginia opposed secession and broke away to form West Virginia. Roughly 300,000 white Southerners and 150,000 former slaves served in the Union military. And UVA's Unionists, despite their small numbers, are part of this larger story of Southern division and dissent. UVA alum William Parks Rucker helps illustrate this first theme. Rucker was born in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1832 and studied medicine at UVA in the early 1850s. In 1860, he delivered dozens of speeches for the moderate Constitutional Union Party, which he viewed as the only party that could hold the country together. After Lincoln won the election, Rucker opposed secession with, quote, all the force and fire in my soul and tongue, and he called Confederates, quote, thieves and traitors. Rucker's brother fought for the Confederacy, and Rucker's neighbors condemned him as an abolitionist and a vile Lincolnist, but he remained steadfastly loyal to the Union, writing that he would, quote, stick a dagger through my own heart before I would fire one ball through the flag of my country. In July 1861, 2 days after the First Battle of Bull Run, a Confederate mob attacked Rucker outside the post office. Rucker stabbed and killed one assailant in self-defense, and then drew his gun to hold the others at bay. He eventually fled Union lines and served as a local guide for Union forces. He helped capture Confederate supplies, burn Confederate bridges, and arrest local Confederate leaders. Local editors attacked him as a notorious scoundrel and a desperate villain, and his neighbors threatened to hang him. Confederates, in fact, captured him in July 1862, and he spent the next year in prison. Union forces tried again and again to rescue him, and he finally escaped in October of 1862. He returned to Union lines and became a major in the Union Army. And after the war, Rucker became a radical Republican and urged Northerners not to forgive or forget Confederate treason. He reminded voters that Confederates, quote, put iron on my wrists and sought to put a noose around my neck. He also played a small role in the creation of the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C. When news of Lincoln's death reached Rucker's home, his former slave, Charlotte Scott, pledged $5 to help build a monument to the martyred president's memory. Rucker helped publicize the project, which he hoped would heal the country's racial and regional divisions. He hoped that every dollar would come from former slaves and that every state would donate a stone. Inspired by Charlotte Scott, African Americans raised more than $20,000 to build the monument. And this monument, depicting Abraham Lincoln setting free a kneeling slave, was dedicated in 1876. And men like Rucker rejected the Confederacy in part because of everything the Union represented. Dr. Gary Gallagher reminds us that for 19th century Americans, the Union, quote, represented the cherished legacy of the founding generation, a government that enshrined political liberty and economic opportunity for all white men. Americans believed the fate of freedom in America and around the world depended on the Union's survival, and they were fiercely committed to preserving it. As one UVA Unionist explained, loyal Americans would, quote, maintain the integrity of the Union if it cost every drop of blood and every dollar in the country. And this theme of Union is especially clear in the life of Arkansas lawyer William Meade Fishback. Fishback was born in Culpeper County, Virginia in 1831 and studied law at UVA in the early 1850s at the same time as Rucker. He briefly lived in Springfield, Illinois, where he performed some legal work for Abraham Lincoln, who actually encouraged him to stay in Springfield. But poor health forced Fishback to move south to Arkansas in the late 1850s. And in 1861, Fishback served as a Unionist delegate to the Arkansas Secession Convention. Secessionists attacked him as a, quote, traitor to the South and vowed to hang him if he attended the convention. But Fishback refused to back down. On March 18th, he voted to postpone a vote on secession, a tactic meant to prevent secession altogether. But then in April of 1861, Confederates attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, galvanizing public opinion in the North and the South. Suddenly, Arkansas voters overwhelmingly supported secession, and Unionists like Fishback were powerless to stop them. That September, Fishback fled 100 miles north to Missouri and swore an oath of allegiance to the Union. His son George owned a Republican newspaper in St. Louis, and Fishback lent his pen to the Union cause. Together, father and son began calling for emancipation in early 1862, and they declared the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, the bravest thing of the age. Fishback appealed to readers' unionism, attacking Confederates for, quote, loving their cotton or the Negro more than they love their country, end quote. Because slavery had caused secession, Fishback argued, the Union could never be secure as long as slavery survived. He declared slavery, quote, the greatest enemy of our peace and prosperity, and he urged Arkansas readers, or Southern readers, to, quote, never sheathe the sword until every trace of slavery is wiped out finally and forever. Fishback returned home to Arkansas in 1863 as the Union Army advanced into the state. And that November, he became a colonel in the Union Army and raised a regiment of loyal Arkansas volunteers. He never led the men into battle, instead devoting his time to restoring Arkansas to the Union. Under Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan, a state would be readmitted to the Union once 10% of its voters swore an oath of allegiance and agreed to accept emancipation. And so Fishback and his allies began drafting a new constitution to meet those requirements. And he also published a newspaper called The Unconditional Union to urge voters to ratify that constitution. For Fishback, the Union was, quote, the best government on earth, sanctified by the sacred sacrifices which our revolutionary fathers made to establish it. Now, with Union soldiers monitoring the polls, loyal voters approved the Constitution, and lawmakers chose Fishback as one of Arkansas's United States senators. Republicans in Congress, however, refused to seat him. They feared that Lincoln was moving too quickly, that if Southern states were returned to the Union too quickly, African Americans would remain vulnerable and oppressed. And unable to take a seat in Congress, Fishback returned to Arkansas and, after the war, became a fierce critic of radical Reconstruction. He deemed African American suffrage, quote, too preposterous to be discussed, insisting that freedmen were, quote, incapable of taking care of themselves, end quote. He broke ties with Republicans and joined the Democratic Party, eventually becoming governor in 1892. Fishback's post-war career brings us to a third important theme, the moderation of most loyal Americans. Most Americans went to war in 1861 not to destroy slavery, not to transform the South, but to preserve the Union. They viewed themselves as moderates and rejected radicalism in all its forms. Most Southerners, and many Southerners, in fact, stayed loyal to the Union precisely because they believed slavery was safest in the Union. During the war, many loyal Americans realized that slavery helped sustain the Confederate war effort, and in response, Americans accepted emancipation as a military necessity. But after Confederates surrendered, many Americans considered the work of the war, the work of saving the Union, fully accomplished. They hoped to quickly rebuild and reunite the country, leaving the South's social order essentially unchanged. Missouri lawyer James Overton Broadhead demonstrates this theme. Broadhead was born in Charlottesville in 1819 and studied law at UVA in the mid-1830s. He settled in Missouri and became a leader in the state's Whig Party, spending several years in the state legislature. When the Whig Party collapsed in the 1850s, Broadhead became a Republican. But like Fishback, he was a moderate, and he condemned both abolitionists and secessionists. He voted for Lincoln in 1860, but he assured voters that Lincoln was quote, an honest man and a patriot, not an abolitionist, not a fanatic. Lincoln, he predicted, would preserve slavery, quote, just where it is, securing Southerners' rights, preserving the Union, and permanently settling the slavery issue. As Southern states began seceding, Broadhead organized an unconditional Union party and helped raise 4 Union regiments. He also served in Missouri's 1861 Constitutional Convention, where he vowed to support, quote, almost any proposition that would preserve the integrity of the Union. He warned that secession would destroy slavery in Missouri. If the state remained in the Union, he argued, it could invoke the Fugitive Slave Law and appeal to sympathetic federal courts. But if Missouri seceded, it would lose those protections and find itself surrounded by free states, which would provide refuge to their slaves. The convention overwhelmingly voted to stay in the Union, and Broadhead became a lieutenant colonel in the Missouri State Militia. He also served as an assistant U.S. attorney and a provost marshal general. During the war, his attitudes towards slavery gradually evolved. He enforced the Second Confiscation Act, which freed slaves owned by Confederate soldiers, and he also called for gradual emancipation in Missouri, proposing to free all slaves born after 1870. Now, this plan, Broadhead explained, would force African Americans into decades-long apprenticeships. But in his words, it would, quote, establish the great leading distinction between slavery and freedom. The law would recognize their rights. By the end of the war, however, Broadhead worried that the Union war effort had gone too far. He attacked radical Republicans as revolutionaries. He helped loyal Southerners recover their fugitive slaves, and he proved reluctant to recruit African American soldiers. After the war, he left the Republican Party and became a leader in Missouri's conservative Unionist Party. Broadhead called for reconciliation and reunion with former Confederates and ignored the plight of freedmen and women. He attacked Republicans' experiment in biracial democracy, writing that he could, quote, never justify the acts of Reconstruction. Republicans, in his words, had, quote, plundered and outraged the rights of the Southern people by abolishing slavery and giving African Americans the right to vote. So again, most loyal Americans were political moderates. They fought to preserve, to restore the Union, and in their minds, the longer Reconstruction lasted, the longer that goal remained unfinished. This mindset helps us understand why Reconstruction failed. For most Americans, emancipation was not a commitment to racial justice. It was a, quote, military necessity meant to weaken the Confederacy. After the war, as Southerners emerged unrepentant, passing harsh black codes and re-electing Confederate leaders to Congress, loyal Americans realized that they needed to punish former Confederates and empower and protect freedmen. Still, most viewed these Reconstruction Acts as a radical means to a conservative, to a moderate end, as a way to prevent future bloodshed and ensure a lasting peace. The 14th Amendment, revealingly, has one clause granting citizenship to African Americans and 2 clauses punishing those who, quote, engaged in insurrection against the government. Even so, the Civil War held genuinely transformative potential. African Americans began fleeing to Union lines almost immediately, and their determination to seek freedom helped unravel slavery across the South. In a country that denied their equality and even their full humanity, African Americans demanded justice and fought to turn a war for union into a war for liberation. Their military service helped win the war, and their post-war commitment to building schools, casting ballots, and running for office against horrific obstacles helped move the country closer to its ideals. Those efforts also helped inspire some white Americans to pursue justice as well. Among UVA's Unionists, Henry Winter Davis provides a dramatic example. Davis was born in Maryland in 1817 and studied law at UVA in the late 1830s. He came from a slaveholding family, but he developed mildly anti-slavery views and felt a, quote, strong revulsion of feeling at the aspect of slavery at UVA. Davis joined the nativist Know Nothing Party in the 1850s and served in Congress from 1855 to 1861. He too was a moderate before the war. He supported the Constitutional Union Party in 1860, and early in the war, he attacked abolitionists as, quote, ignorant fanatics. By 1862, however, he embraced emancipation and turned dramatically toward radicalism. He supported ending slavery in Washington, D.C. and in the country's territories. He called for, quote, a war of subjugation, urging Congress to confiscate Confederate property and redistribute it among former slaves. He also hoped to arm African-American men and provide explicit legal freedoms, legal protection for freedmen. In 1862, he won a seat in Congress as an unconditional Unionist, and he soon outlined his own plan for Reconstruction. Lincoln, as I mentioned, planned to readmit Confederate states once 10% of their voters swore an oath that they would stay loyal going forward. But the Wade-Davis bill, co-authored by Henry Winter Davis, required 50% of voters to swear an ironclad oath they had always been loyal. Congress passed this Wade-Davis bill in 1864, but Lincoln pocket vetoed it. Davis's policies were too radical for many of his constituents, and Baltimore's Union Party refused to renominate him in 1864. But in his final weeks in office, Davis continued to fight for emancipation and civil rights. He helped the House of Representatives pass the 13th Amendment in January of 1865, and he also championed African-American suffrage, arguing that freedmen had earned the right to vote through their wartime service. They had proven themselves the equals of white men on the battlefield, and they deserved to be the equals of white men at the ballot box as well. Davis died of pneumonia in December of 1865 and never lived to see the 14th and 15th Amendments that he had played a role in setting in motion. But a handful of UVA Unionists continued that fight for justice. Robert Shannon served as a federal commissioner in Louisiana, where he vigorously enforced the Civil Rights Act. Virginia Judge Alexander Reeves argued that African Americans, quote, deserved all the rights of citizenship, and he declared the ballot box, quote, the only safeguard for their freedom. Oregon editor Benjamin Dowell championed civil rights and called for, quote, equal justice south and north, urging every state to root out its discriminatory laws. After the Civil War, UVA largely erased these men and their stories from its history. The university celebrated the Confederacy and carefully kept alive the memories of the men who had served its lost cause. That story had no place for division or dissent, no place for the dozens of alumni and faculty who stayed loyal to the Union. Despite their small numbers, UVA's Unionists mattered. They contributed to the war effort as generals, surgeons, recruiters, editors, and congressmen. In small but important ways, they helped to win the war and ensure the death of slavery. They remind us that the South remained divided, that the Union carried enormous ideological power, that most loyal Americans were political moderates, and that the war nonetheless held incredible and transformative potential. Now, the most radical among these men, Henry Winter Davis, Robert Shannon, Benjamin Dowell, and a handful of others, carry even greater significance. They issued a powerful challenge to the South's racial order, defending biracial democracy and demanding freedom and justice for all Americans. The moderation of most Unionists helps explain why Reconstruction failed, but the radicalism of these men reminds us that the advent of Jim Crow and segregation was not inevitable or immediate or uncontested. Decades after the war, an aging Joseph Breckinridge reminded listeners that the Union cause, despite its shortcomings, was, quote, righteous and right. He predicted that no immortal poet, quote, no Homer, will sing the contest of the war. But he offered his own halting voice to honor his Union comrades and make certain that the world, quote, will not willingly let their names die. Our UVA Unionist project, in a small way, I hope, will help ensure that their names won't. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that. I apologize to everybody who is following us on Facebook. I understand that the stream went down over there, but we will post a recording on our website. We will have a recording of this entire event. Will be will be sent out to those who participated. We will post links on social media all right. So now let's go to the website and show you what we have been working on for the last few years here. So for those of you who were with us last time for Black Virginians in Blue, a lot of this is going to look very familiar. The websites are more or less mirror images of each other. They have the same kinds of content. They have the same kinds of, it has the same structure. So once you've mastered one, you can master the other. The big difference being, you know, the different subject matter and the fact that UVA Unionist is a smaller project in terms of how many men it covers. There are 256 Black soldiers or sailors for Black Virginians in Blue and only about 68 for UVA Unionists. Plus, I should say, 3 politicians who served in Congress during the war as well. But the main focus is definitely on the men who served in the military in some capacity. So this is the homepage of UVA Unionists. You can go right up here to the top and you can do a search if you're interested in something in particular about slavery, about a particular person. You want to see, you know, who ran into Abraham Lincoln. You can search for Lincoln. That is definitely something you can do. Uh, we also have other ways for you to get into the website. And what I suggest, the very first thing you do, and as it says right here on the home page, is to go look at 2 of our essays. We have one that's covers our soldiers and sailors during the war and one that covers them after the war. Those are the 2 overview essays that will give you a lot of what Brian just talked about just now, that larger sense of, okay, what is the larger story that we're trying to convey here? What do all these individual stories add up to? And how are some of these individual stories particularly noteworthy and unique as well? So let's go into people. And people is where you're going to want to go when you decide, okay, I want to look up the biography of someone. I want to look up people who served in particular regiments, like the 1st New York Veterans Cavalry. I want to look up people who enlisted in the state of Pennsylvania. I want to look at people who ended the war, came into the war as, you know, a lieutenant or left the war with the rank of general. I'm interested in occupations. Show me all the doctors, the lawyers, etc. What you can do is one of the best ways to search this, and you can search by name as well, but one of the best ways to search this is by role. And role is what that person, you know, what their function is in the database. So we don't just look at the histories of the men, but we look at their families as well. So we've written biographies for all of their spouses. We haven't written biographies for the children. That's a little bit beyond our means and resources. But the men are divided up into several categories. Are they a politician? Are they a sailor? Are they a soldier? Sometimes they're more than one thing. So let's just look at all the soldiers, for example. And we get an alphabetical list of all the soldiers. And if you, when you're doing your searches and you see this with essay right here, that means that we have a biography that we've written about these men. And so let me go into a couple of them. James Overton Broadhead was one of the men that was discussed by Brian in his wonderful talk. Thank you again very much, Brian, for that wonderful talk. And he was actually born, you know, right here in Charlottesville, Virginia. So there are a few people from Albemarle County who make up this project. Of course, a lot of people from attended UVA from all over the Old Dominion and from over the South, and some from the North as well. So we have a biography of Broadhead, a pretty basic biography. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that he's one of the few men that we have a much longer biographical essay about. So he has an essay, and he also has these documents, which I'll talk about more in just a second. These documents are primary source documents that, just like the biographies, were done by undergraduates under Brian's supervision and my supervision. The undergraduates wrote the biographies based upon the research that was done. They transcribed primary sources that are particularly interesting about individuals. They wrote a lot of our essays, which we'll get to in just a second as well. So there's tons of undergraduate work that went into this. I want to give a special shout out to Cole Davidson, Annie Valentine, and Seth Stowe, who all worked on the UVA Unionist project this academic year. They're only 3 of about a dozen. So thank you all very much for your help. Let's go back to our search and let's go look at someone that Brian didn't talk about. One of my favorite Unionists, Charles Ewing, who was the son of Thomas Ewing of the famous Ewing family of Ohio. He served in the presidential cabinet, a Whig cabinet. He served in Congress as well. He had a number of sons who all went on to become Union generals. Charles Ewing was the brother-in-law of a more famous man you've probably heard of, William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman married Charles's sister, Ellen. And so we've written a biography of Charles. He was one of probably the only one to really be promoted to general before the end of the war. A lot of our men became generals at the very end of the war as brevet ranks, but Charles actually served for some time as a general in the Union Army. And we have more documents about him as well. Charles is illustrative of one of the big differences between the other project and this project, and that is that Charles has several personal paper collections spread across the country. He's got one at the Library of Congress. His family has a collection at Ohio Historical Society, or now it's Ohio History Connection, and he has another one, his family has another one at the University of Notre Dame. So some of these men were extremely prominent, as Brian said, and they left behind a lot of paperwork. So we've only transcribed 2 of his many letters from the Civil War. If we move on to the next section, so another way to look at our project is to say, okay, where are these men from and where did they end up? We didn't actually have a lot of good data about where they mustered in or where they mustered out for all of these men. After all, some of them are just politicians, or were just in the service for a short while. So we have a map of birthplaces and death places. And somebody in the Q&A, and I'll answer this question now, asked, so were all of these gentlemen from West Virginia because that was a bastion of unionism during the Civil War? Well, some of them were, but a lot of them weren't. And if you go into our map of birthplaces, you're going to see we only have a few from the deep South down here. We have many more from this border region right here, where right along where the slave South met the free North. A lot of them from the state of Virginia, a lot of them from Maryland. If we zoom in a little bit more on Maryland and we click on Annapolis over here, we have Henry Winter Davis, one of those, the last man that Brian focused on. And if we click on this link here, we go right out to Henry Winter Davis's biography. So that gives you a sense of where these men were from. Where did they end up? And so the death place map is really useful for that. And now the map aggregates points that are close to each other at a bird's eye view, but as you zoom in, you get to see the individual people. And yes, you do see a lot of people who are here. Again, they're in that same region. They're, they die or in pretty much the same area where they were born. They stay in the same area their whole lives. But you do see this Western movement. Not everyone, but a few of them do move over here west, and that's indicative of a general trend of Western movement across the United States in the 19th century. If we go into San Francisco, we can see William Evelyn Hopkins and George Worth Woods. George Worth Woods was a very interesting individual who did a lot of service after the war as a surgeon for the Navy in the Far East in countries such as China and Korea and Japan. He actually was one of the attending physicians who cared for the last king of Hawaii before he passed away. Woods and Hopkins are both sailors, and you can see the list of all the ships that they served on right here. And again, you can just click on this link and go right out to their biography um, and learn a little bit more. So that's another way to get into our data. Another way is to look at stories, and stories are really essays. And a lot of these were written by Brian, and some of them were written by undergraduates. And again, the first stories you're going to want to deal with are these ones right here: UVA Unionists in the War and UVA Unionists after the war. Those are the two overview essays. There are other essays that you can look at. If you don't want to look at essays about people, you simply unclick the check mark here. If you don't care about battles, you can uncheck that. But you can just kind of scroll down and see all the essays that we have. Brian was referring to that Stanton article about neglected alumni. Here they are right here. This article by me is about that newspaper exchange back in 1913. And then we have really wonderful bunch of essays about different men and their experiences before, during, and after the war. One of my favorite stories is this about these men from the 149th Indiana who all decided to go to UVA for medical school after the war. Well, why did they do that? Maybe we can talk about that later. I would definitely recommend you check out this story. It's really incredible. The research that was done by Amelia Wald, a recent graduate of UVA, recently got her bachelor's from UVA's history program. Just phenomenal research that was done by our UVA undergraduates. But we are, for the sake of time, I'm going to keep on moving on, and I'm not going to go into any of the essays. I'll encourage you to come back and check out that section of the website yourself. Documents is a little bit like essays in that, again, there are different types of documents, just like different types of essays, and you can unclick those that you don't want to see to filter them out. Let me just go into a few of them. So here's they're chronologically ordered. And so the very first one is by a man named Henry Morris. Henry Morris in the 1830s was the drawing instructor at UVA, and he comes to UVA, and his first impressions of Charlottesville in the late summer, I guess early fall, are not very favorable at all. He writes to his sister about how oppressive and fearsome the heat is, and he's a northerner, so he's not used to it. And so I think we can all of us from Albemarle County, especially today, can relate to that sentiment. Another more serious letter is this James O. Broadhead to William F. Broadhead letter that, and again, Broadhead is someone that Brian highlighted. And here's Broadhead writing shortly before the start of the Civil War. Doesn't know the Civil War is going to come, of course, but he's writing shortly before the Civil War. And, he got his law degree at UVA, and his brother is following in his footsteps. But Broadhead is really dismayed because he thinks that the university is not teaching enough reverence for the Constitution, and he thinks that that part of the South, Virginia, has gone perfectly, you can read the letter for yourself, has gone perfectly mad about slavery, and he is actually helping his brother to realize that, yes, if you want to leave early, yeah, I totally support that, and here's why: because I think that UVA has gone too far down the possible road to maybe secession in the future. Certainly, it's gotten too obsessed with slavery and the defense of slavery instead of teaching the Constitution. So Broadhead, this is Broadhead weighs in. And another source that's kind of interesting that I like is this one by James Deems, and it's atypical. It's actually sheet music, right? And so James Deems, during the secession crisis, he writes this. He's from Maryland. He writes this patriotic hymn in defense of the Union, even before Fort Sumter has been attacked. Deems doesn't just write music during the war. He actually goes on to be the colonel of the 1st Maryland Cavalry and leads that regiment at the Battle of Gettysburg. So he's a very prominent individual that, again, sort of escaped the notice of UVA. Of course, if a Confederate had been alumni of UVA, had been at Gettysburg. Past chroniclers, past historians would note that, but Deems is sort of one of those people that slipped under the radar, at least as far as UVA is concerned. And there's many, many, many more very interesting sources. I'll just say that one of the big differences between this project and the other project is that we don't rely so heavily on pension records. For the African American of the Black Virginians in Blue Project, a lot of the written records we have, the only written records we have are those federal pension records. But for these men, they left behind, sheet music, they left behind personal papers, they left behind letters to the government, letters to Abraham Lincoln. There's just an abundance of primary source material. And there's more photographs of them. About half, we have photographs of half of these men. It's just a different kind of source base. So they're both two sides of Southern Unionism: white Southern Unionism and Black Southern Unionism. But in terms of the research, they're quite different in terms of the sources. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the website. We can post the link again. I posted it at the very beginning of our conversation. And I just wanted to welcome Brian back here. Brian, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A here. Let me see. I think we've got one that actually dovetails onto one of the questions I was going to ask you, Brian. And that is, were some of these UVA Unionists from slaveholding families? If so, what was their attitude toward emancipation, and how did their attitude change over time?
Yes, that's a great question, and sort of briefly alluded to it during the talk, but for a long time, the few people that would acknowledge these people assumed they must have been all Northerners, and again, as we found, 2/3 of them were from the South, and about half of the UVA Unionists came from slaveholding families, and many of them stayed loyal to the Union precisely because they believed slavery was safest in the Union. They worried that secession would lead to chaos and disorder, and that as part of that chaos, would give African Americans the opportunity to escape from slavery, as indeed ended up happening. And in terms of how their attitudes changed, not everyone recorded their thoughts, so we can't say for certain. Some of them, like Broadhead, for example, eventually kind of grew disillusioned with the Union war effort. But from what we can tell, a lot of them were like Fishback in that their ideas towards slavery evolved. They realized that it was sort of the source of the rebellion, and their kind of wartime kind of animosity toward the Confederate treason was so much that they were willing to accept the death of slavery in order to save the Union and ensure kind of peace and prosperity going forward. So definitely there's a really interesting way in which the war forces their ideas to evolve. Yeah.
Right. So, one of the things that you make very clear in your research on Broadhead is, he's one of those guys, as you say, who we need to preserve the Union, otherwise slavery is doomed, and comes to support emancipation. He's a slaveholder himself. He has at least 2 slaves at the beginning of the war. But he goes seemingly in the completely opposite direction. There's a question about Broadhead and about his post-war journey. And he becomes, this very conservative Democrat who's opposed to Reconstruction. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the recent stories that you've been writing about men who actually do support Reconstruction?
Yes. So some of the more recent blog posts that I've been posting that are available on the Now Civil War Center's blog on its website uncover the stories of UVA Unionists of UVA alumni who stayed loyal to the Union as civilians. So people who were, say judges or editors or governors and not necessarily soldiers. And what's so interesting is several of those men ardently supported Reconstruction. So while men like Fishback and Broadhead eventually turn against Reconstruction and fight to reassert white supremacy after the war, other men like like Alexander Reeves, a judge in Charlottesville, and like Benjamin Dowell, this really fascinating editor out in Oregon who was from Charlottesville originally, become passionate advocates of racial justice. And they realize that the country, it's not enough just to end slavery. We have to enfranchise and empower and protect African Americans in order to make that freedom meaningful. So there's some really fascinating stories that so I hope we'll have opportunities to sort of delve into those stories going forward. But,
So yeah, well, I mean, one of those stories that's going to be coming up real soon is the story of Alexander Rives, right? And he has some interesting connections to our other project. Could you speak to that at all?
yes, absolutely. The relationship to the Black Virginians in Blue and the Uva Unionist project. So again, these projects, we've been doing the research on them kind of at the same time, and a lot of the same people have been working on the same projects. And they're very closely related in the sense of, uncovering local stories of untold unionism. In terms of the tone of the two projects, we've been very careful. The Black Virginians in Blue project is more clearly a celebratory project. These are men,
Yeah.
African Americans from Albemarle County, who endured and escaped slavery, whether before the war or after or during the war, and men who fought to win the war to save the Union, but also to turn that war for Union into a war for freedom. And in many cases, they went on to fight for racial justice after the war. Whereas Uva Unionists is a more complicated story in that some of these men were bitterly conservative. So we've been very careful to sort of tell Black Virginians in Blue as a celebratory story, while telling UVA Unionists as more of a kind of recovering these stories as a way to sort of better understand the past. And that being said, there are certainly stories within UVA Unionists that, in my opinion, are worth celebrating. Again, the stories of men like Henry Winter Davis, who begins his life as a slaveholder and then undergoes a transformation, and then by the end of his life becomes an advocate for justice. And they show us that change is possible, that Jim Crow segregation was not inevitable. So I think there are fascinating stories and really interesting relationships between these two projects.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that both projects have that sort of geographical focus in terms of one's Albemarle County and the other one's UVA. So it's centered on people who have a relationship to a place, but we end up having people from all over, Black Virginians in Blue, people enlist from all over because they've been forced out of the state for whatever reasons, by slavery, by manumission laws, etc. And then with UVA Unionists, a lot of people have, are from the north, or they've moved west, or UVA is an important school that draws a lot of people for things like medical school and law school. So there's that interesting kind of geographical reach that both of them have that, haven't really thought about maybe enough. But Rives is also interesting too, because he runs against one of our Black Virginians in Blue for political office, right? In 1867 in the state constitutional convention in Virginia. Is that right? He runs against Taylor, James T.S. Taylor, who is the most prominent and most important of our Black Virginians in Blue in terms of being involved in politics after the war and being involved in Charlottesville politics after the war. The two of them go head to head, and Taylor wins and goes and plays an important role at the Constitutional Convention for the state of Virginia. But it doesn't seem like there was any lasting animosity. I don't know, but because Rives continued to be an advocate for Black rights. Is that correct?
Yes, and in fact, so Rives has a really interesting political transformation, because he too was a planter before the war, and after the war he tries to chart out this conservative path where he wants to punish Confederate leaders, but urges President Andrew Johnson to pardon kind of the rank and file Confederate soldiers. He sees those rank and file Confederates as victims of this slaveholder leader rebellion. And I think Rives undergoes this transformation where when he runs against James T.S. Taylor, newspapers call Rives a conservative Republican. Whereas, in the years and decades ahead of that, after that, he goes on to argue really forcefully as a judge in favor of African American rights. So we can't say for sure, but Rives definitely undergoes this transformation, and perhaps his encounters with men like James T.S. Taylor play a role in prompting that transformation.
Right, right. So I have a couple questions here from the Q&A, Brian, that I guess we both can answer. But the first question is there any plan to create a permanent monument to our UVA Unionists? And the answer is no. There is no current plan. The monument to them is the website. And again, as Brian said, it's not a monument in terms of how past monuments were done, where it's we focus on only the positive and sweep the negative under the rug. It shouldn't be seen as celebratory. Just as Brian said, it should be seen as diversifying the narrative of the Civil War, of the local Civil War story, just like with Black Virginians in Blue. It's about telling these stories, these amazing, these stories that have been neglected. There are thousands of Confederate stories, and they have been told in monuments, books, speeches, and they have just dominated everything from the late 19th century through pretty much the end of the 20th century. But it's time, that we acknowledge that there's another side to the story. So there's no current plans to do a monument. Some people ask me, shouldn't some of the UVA Unionists who died during the Civil War be on the plaques that used to be on the rotunda? Well, none of them died because of the Civil War. A couple of them died of old age, so they wouldn't qualify for the plaques, to be honest with you. And the other question is how many of the UVA Unionists returned to Charlottesville after the war, and how are they received by the community? And Brian, I can think of, Albert Henry Tuttle, who's the longtime chair of biology, he doesn't return to Charlottesville. He moves to Charlottesville to work there. And as far as we can tell, his Civil War service was not held against him, and he seemed to adapt pretty well to the sort of Southern climate, Southern culture all around him. As a really nice essay by recent graduate Clayton Butler of the PhD history program at UVA puts out there. But the only other person I can think of is John Thornley, who was in the Navy, maybe a surgeon. Most of them were surgeons, actually. I should say there's a lot of surgeons in the Navy from UVA, and he returns, and there doesn't seem to be. We don't know if his service was held against him. He seems to have lived in Albemarle for a long time. Although he's actually buried up in Brooklyn, New York, I believe. So, but do you know of anybody else who returned? I can't think of anybody.
Others that visited. So again, Benjamin Dowell, who I wrote a blog post about him on the Now Center's website. Was from Charlottesville,
Right.
was a Oregon editor, kind of radical Republican, who visits Charlottesville after the war and kind of waxes poetic about the wonderful times that he had there, and he's really hopeful that UVA, before the war, UVA, in his words, had taught secession and treason, and now he hopes it'll kind of begin teaching unity and liberty. So that we sort of get glimpses like that, but no, the sense that I get is the few Unionists like Tuttle that were here, UVA was willing to kind of accommodate them, but it in no way celebrated their Union service. It was something to kind of sweep under the rug. Definitely not something to discuss or to glorify.
Right. I mean, when they invite everybody back in the early 19 teens for a veterans reunion, basically, the surviving UVA Confederate veterans, they don't say, "Hey, Tuttle, who's still alive at this time, would you like to come over and be the token Unionist?" They just don't even. They give those guys a medal. They don't talk about him. And the one Unionist that they do celebrate in like the alumni magazine is Charles A. Briggs, and it's not because Briggs is a Unionist; it's because he's a famous theologian. So his and they even get the details of his service wrong. So it just goes to show you, how neglected these people were. Looks like we have time for maybe one last thing. What is the takeaway that you'd like people to take away from today? Like, what is if there's like a message that you want people to get from this project and from your work, Brian, what would you tell people?
Of course. So once again, thank you all for coming and for seeing this website. I think the major takeaway, these UVA Unionists, despite their small numbers, matter. They matter locally because UVA erased them from its history, and our project restores them to the narrative and gives UVA a more complete idea of its history. But they also matter nationally because they remind us that the South was divided. In popular culture, we often have this idea that Southerners had no choice. They were devoted to their states and went along with their states. The kind of classic image of Robert E. Lee, refusing to draw his sword against Virginia. But what's interesting is in that story, when Robert E. Lee resigns from the United States Army, he's offering his resignation to Winfield Scott, who's a fellow Virginian. Now, neither of these men were UVA alumni, but they speak to larger tensions and larger issues at stake that this project explores. These ideas of loyalty that are extremely complicated. Our project illustrates the importance of these men and illustrates the importance of the Union as an idea worth fighting for, worth risking their lives for. That's what I hope people take away from this project.
Thank you very much, Brian. That's wonderful. And if I can just tie it back to our other project as well, everyone, we're talking about a relatively small group of people in the Black Virginians in Blue project and a relatively small group of people in the UVA Unionist project, but they're indicative of a much larger story of hundreds of thousands of Black Southerners and hundreds of thousands of white Southerners, with most of them being from the border South, the border states, who served in the Union Army and helped to defeat the Confederacy. So this is a small story, a small window into this much larger story of Black and white Southern Unionism, represented by our two digital projects, Black Virginians in Blue and UVA Unionists. So thank you so much for everyone for being here. We will post a recording shortly. We have a new YouTube channel where we will have that, and you can also catch our events from the rest of this past semester there. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Kevin Caprice, for your technical assistance. And thank you, everyone, for being here. We look forward to seeing you at future Now events next fall. Have a good night.